There are two other books that I wish to talk about. One is a book on Girish Kasravalli, and the other book is on N. Lakshmi Narayan. Now let me begin with the second book. When what we call mainstream, popular, commercial cinema was riding high, especially through Rajkumar in Karnataka, there was this filmmaker who was open to the alternative traditions of filmmaking, and that's N. Lakshmi Narayan. Now, who wanted to make films that were not too cerebral, as we understand the word, highbrow, that's another word that figures, nor would it recreate the stereotypes of so-called mainstream popular commercial cinema. That was N. Lakshmi Narayan. So this book of mine tries to trace through a particular director, N. Lakshmi Narayan, the search for alternatives, alternative narrative schemes, alternative cinematic images within the Kannada tradition. This was the mid-60s. That's that book. Second, so what we call the new wave, Kannada new wave, in fact there was really no new wave, came to the foreground Girish Kasravalli, who really, even to this day, he made his first film Gatashraddha in 75, which was released in 77, the one who sustains excellent cinematic images and who knows the craft of filmmaking and who could be placed with anybody significant anywhere in the world, who furthered Lakshmi Narayan's path, who created new dimensions. In fact, there are people who believe that the new wave started with Samskara in 70. It did, but if you were to watch Gatashraddha, that's the real film. Samskara, very important, historically very important, but filled with flaws. So if you are to speak using the language of chronology, linearity, Samskara is the film. So I thought it was very important to write on Girish Kasravalli. Also for this reason, that if you have the Indian languages, literatures, the bhashas, I think here is one man also struggling with the huge, monstrous power of Hindi cinema, which is regarded as national cinema, as if films made in the Indian languages are regional. Now, like very important writers in the Indian linguistic traditions, Indian languages, the bhashas as we call them, here is one man who is sustaining the multiplicity, the plurality of the cinematic traditions. In that sense, a man who knows the new wave cinema, neo-realism of the West, of the Italian filmmakers, the French filmmakers, very significant because he is rooting everything in our specific, local, particular traditions and derives his universality. So I think it's again my interest in pluralities, multiplicities and alternatives, and that's my book on Girish Kasravalli, which is entitled Culturing Realism, that he uses realism but cultures it, and it's also a kind of realism, so you can read it as a verb and a noun, culturing realism. It's a realism that cultures, and we also need to culture realism because it can become very, very photographic. I think this is the interaction. In fact, it's a cultural narrative, so it has nothing to do with filmmaking. It has nothing to do with the technical aspects of cinema. In fact, these are, though I have written on cinema, these are, I would call, cultural narratives of cinema. So I don't talk of photography, I don't talk of lens, I don't talk of filters, I don't talk of construction of script, screenplay, but to draw attention to its cultural dimensions. What I mean is, you see, just as we have cultural theory, political theory, when it comes to writing, take the texts of film texts, cinematic texts of Girish Kasarole. When the debate was going on between an oppressive tradition and modernity and the woman's question, mid-70s, he comes up with Gata Shraddha. When there were debates about bureaucracy, authoritarianism, especially after the emergency, he comes up with Tabrana Kate, bureaucracy, authoritarianism. When the feminist theoretical positions became more nuanced, he came up with the texts like Nayinirlu, broadly. And when there was a debate about the woman in relation to communalism, communal questions, and in India, especially in relation to the Muslims as minorities, Muslim women within that, he came up with stunning insider narratives, producing films like Hasina, Gulabi Takis. His last film to deal with visions, idealisms, the collapse, the conflict, internal conflict between an idealist and the human being. Idealism as a philosophy, but the idealist philosopher also as a human being within. So you see, his last film was on Gandhi in relation to our world today, of bureaucracy, of the collapse of ideals, of values. We talk of corruption and all that. So positing Gandhi as an idealist, but it's not eulogy, it's not simplistic celebration of Gandhi. The other face of Gandhi emerges too, of a human being with his contradictions, now with his own personal conflicts, dilemmas. So whenever India as a society, not as a nation, whenever Karnataka has come up with theories, with the debates about cultural issues, the films of Girish Kasarole have emerged. So if it's not as if the literary tradition, the intellectual tradition, the written tradition has created cultural debates, cinema for me is very important because it's another cultural narrative which enters this debate, as important as literature, though the tools are very different. So I find Girish Kasarole as important as any filmmaker anywhere in the world. And that's why I think we need to regard, because India does not really have an intellectual tradition of treating cinema as culture. But my struggle has been, and I've written extensively after that, my struggle has been on Marathi cinema, on Iranian cinema, of how the cinematic tradition is diverse, multiple, plural, and also brings us face to face with very important cultural political debates. So it's vital to our cultural politics. And that's my very deep relationship with cinema. In fact, I have never brought theory, any kind of theory, into my analysis, understanding of cultural texts. On the contrary, you see, as a teacher of English, as one who teaches students, I have to be aware of all theories. I'm obliged to. It's an intellectual obligation. But when I turn to actual critiques, actual analysis of texts, it's very, very stunning that the texts themselves lead to theoretical positions, and the significance of the creative processes that they create, open up theoretical spaces by which you also challenge these theories. So it's not a cut and paste job. It's not that you bring theory from outside, but you create theoretical positions. And not just that you create, you also challenge theoretical notions. So if there is a text, a literary text or a cinematic text, none of your theories may fit in. So it leads to the emergence, the birth of perhaps a different kind of a theoretical position. Well, I think Lakshmi Narayan demanded a very different approach as Girish Kasarole. his films did. So I think the works of Lakshmi Narayan I think they led me to make certain formulations that were very different from the formulations I came up with while doing the book on Girish Kasravalli. So, and Lakshmi Narayan is not a new wave filmmaker. The titles of the two books would make it clear. The book on Lakshmi Narayan is called Framing the New Wave. He is not a new wave director. But when it comes to Girish Kasravalli, it's culturing realism, larger cultural questions, political questions. So the works of the two directors suggested different analytical methods, idiom, different perspectives.